looking good. Nice.
Today on Absolute Anthem, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the elements that are integral to the long and healthy life and replayability of a looter shooter experience like Anthem. The same sort of elements that have been make or break for games like The Division, Destiny, and now Destiny 2. I'm of course referring to everything surrounding loot. All of the resources involved with the upgrading of weapons, the upgrading of your javelins, the javelin components in this case even, all of the bits and pieces that make up that core loot ecosystem. That's what we're talking about today. And honestly, this is one of those situations where we come back to what I've talked about earlier, where BioWare has a pretty good point of resource for what has been done right and what has been done wrong when it comes to looter shooters, because The Division and Destiny 1, I think both did loot ecosystems really well, and they only got better over time, whereas a game like Destiny 2 is a prime example of what happens when you pretty much abandon the idea of a loot ecosystem entirely, and you do away with things like random perk rolls, and you create an environment where people can obtain literally everything in your game in under 2 months. It creates an experience that is not healthy long-term, that strips away variety, diversity, and replayability on a very big and very dangerous level. So when we look at these sort of three big looter shooters, I think we can look to The Division and Destiny 1 to see examples of where it was done right, where the developers were able to build a healthy loot ecosystem that ensured that replayability and that longevity for the game, especially when we talk about the hardcore players. And that's the important thing with Anthem here, is that BioWare actually builds the game and its loot ecosystem around the people who are potentially going to put in 5+ hours a day, because those people are out there and they do make up the majority of that hardcore community that's going to keep the game alive. Because if you can please those people and you can create an environment where they have a reason to keep coming back and playing the game hour after hour, hour after hour, even before you start releasing new content, then everyone else behind them who plays less than them is also going to be in a good position. And that's kind of the path that The Division was able to take. In fact, The Division went to the extent that they were so stingy with their loot that they had to do more in order to give people more loot. And now the game is actually in a perfect environment where even if you play a lot, you still aren't going to be able to obtain every single possible role for the many different individual pieces of equipment in the game. They've done a lot to ensure that people have something to hunt for each and every time they log on, and that dedicated players can spend months creating different builds by hunting down different gear sets and different pieces of gear that are perfectly rolled, that have the perfect perks for the loadout for the builds they're trying to create. That's the sort of experience I want to see inside of Anthem, not the one that we got in Destiny 2. When we look at Destiny 1, we also got a really positive experience. The random rolls system for perks in Destiny 1 created an environment where players could hunt for that perfect role of Aya's Luna. There wasn't an infinite number of possibilities. Hell, there wasn't even the same number of possibilities that we get inside of The Division, but there were more than enough in combination with the already large pool of base weapons, ensuring that players could hunt for this version of the hung jury, for example, or get this role for this type of playstyle, or get this role for PvP, or get this role for PvE. It was actually a really great system that didn't maybe have the same complexity or variety as The Division, but still worked really well for the hardcore community long term. We don't actually know a lot about how Anthem's going to handle its loot, but we can look at the things that exist within Anthem that could potentially benefit from a sort of random rolls, sort of generated perk style system. Within the trailer itself from E3 2017, we actually see the player loot only 2 different things. First and foremost is a resource called Brinium Shards, and this actually does tie into what we're talking about, because if there's a system in place that allows players to acquire resources like these Brinium Shards, not just to sell for currency as a sort of farming resource to gain access to more gold or more money, but as an actual resource to upgrade our components on our weapons, on our javelins even, that could be a really powerful thing. And I genuinely want to see Anthem focus more on its RPG elements than it does on its action shooter elements. Like, the action shooter stuff is clearly there, and that's great, but those RPG components should be at the core of the experience. And if I have to go out on the weekend with my friends to farm or to gather resources like Brinium Shards to create the upgrade for my javelin that I've been looking forward to, that's something that interests me as an individual. At least that's the sort of gameplay experience that I would like to have. You know, if I pick up Jera's Wrath like the player does in the trailer here, and I realize, oh, okay, this thing's really cool, but in order to activate this upgrade node, I'm going to need to craft this component with, 10 of these other shards, these platinum shards or something like that. I'm going to be happy about that. I like that idea. I like that layer. I don't want to see that portion of the game streamlined like it was in Destiny 2. Gathering resources and exploring the open world in Destiny 1 was one of my favorite sort of downtime, more relaxed things to do inside of Destiny. And if we have a bigger and more expansive and more organic open world inside of Anthem, then that act could be even more interesting. Not to mention, you can do it as sort of a one-off side project where you're out doing side quests, maybe just hunting down packs of scars, and along the way, you're gathering Brinium shards. I think it's a nice touch. It adds to the overall experience as an RPG, and it does add to the replayability by including a certain element of grind, if you will. So let's take a look at Jera's Wrath, actually. Jera's Wrath is a legendary Volt Rifle at level 35 in this case that we see the player loot after they clean up the Scar ambush in the trailer. Unfortunately, we know pretty much nothing about Jera's Wrath other than the fact that it is legendary, it is a Volt Rifle, and we can see its statistics for damage, accuracy, range, rate of fire, and ammo. If that's as far as Anthem took things, that would probably be a bad sign. If that was the route they were going to go, where weapons were nothing more than a number of statistics and maybe the sort of damage type that they did based on the weapon that they were, that would leave a very basic system that doesn't have a lot of room for random variation among individual weapons. However, this is E3 2017. This was most likely a mock-up, much like when we first saw Thunderlord back at Destiny 1's reveal at E3. We would hope that when we go into our inventory and actually look at Jera's Wrath, we see a selection of perks that identify Jera's Wrath as a unique legendary weapon. And hopefully, either some of those perks are randomly rolled, so my Jera's Wrath can be different from your Jera's Wrath, or the game has enough weapon variety, enough unique weapons similar to an experience like Diablo 3 that it's not really a big deal because you'll just get a different weapon that's different than Jera's Wrath, even if it's slightly similar, even if it's another weapon within the legendary Volt Rifle category. Density, variety, diversity in loot is going to be so important for this game long term. And the good news with Anthem is that not only do we just have those primary weapons that we're equipping, we also have the javelins themselves, of course. So those javelins, their unique chassis, their base abilities, I guess you could say, the idea that the Ranger is more of a jack of all trades, the Colossus is more for tanking, that creates another layer within the loot ecosystem. On top of that, we have attachments and equipment and abilities that hopefully we can unlock, loot, upgrade, craft even, that we can then apply to said javelins to further customize and further create those javelins as our own. That's another layer, again, added into that loot ecosystem. So we've got a good baseline here. It's just a matter of BioWare really making sure that it's all fleshed out enough that, again, the hardcore community doesn't blow through the game in the first month. That is not something we want to see happen. When the game does launch, unless the stars align, I guarantee you there's going to be an issue one way or another with the rate at which players acquire loot. This is just the way I think the cookie crumbles with these sorts of games. I don't think anyone has the perfect answer yet. If you look at Destiny 1 and The Division, early days, the biggest problem those games had was they actually didn't give players enough loot. Players felt like they weren't being rewarded for their time. Their time wasn't really being respected, if you will, right? We can't, that's obviously bad, but I wouldn't mind it if the game started out that way, because you can always tune up from that. I think the moment you give players too much loot and everything is thrown at them, like Destiny 2 did, is the moment it'll be too late before you realize it was a problem, and you end up with pretty much the Destiny 2 issue in a nutshell, where now all of a sudden they're realizing, wow, we need to reintroduce random weapon rolls, we need to do all of this stuff with the modding system, we need to essentially rebuild our game for it to have any sort of substantial replayability for our core audience, for our core community. So if the game is in a position like Division was at launch, right, and things are really sort of bare bones and we're not getting loot all the time, that would honestly be best case scenario, because then BioWare can tune up from that and consider how loot is dropped for the player. That's honestly, when I think about what concerns me, I know everybody's like EA and loot boxes, but I think Battlefield 5 now sets a good precedent for this game. I think more about that loot ecosystem, because you can have the biggest, most beautiful open world, right? But if the player collects all of the loot or feels as if they don't have anything to chase, if you will, after the first month, then you're going to have a lot of issues. No amount of content can fix that. You know, this is the important thing about looter shooters, is that you can't just throw content at the problem, because content can be ran through. Content is finite. But some sort of a random roll system, the idea that the player is always chasing that perfect loadout, or at least a new loadout, a new build for their javelin, that is something that can essentially be created in a way that it appears infinite to the player, in the same way that it does in the Division right now. We'll see where it all goes. Obviously, we know very little in terms of how BioWare is going to handle this, and I'm hoping we learn more at E3, and hopefully we can talk about this subject once again once we learn more, hopefully, at E3. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below, guys. What do you look for in a looter shooter? You know, if you want to reference games like The Division, Diablo, even, you know, looters in general, I guess you could say, Borderlands can be thrown into there. You know, pull out some of those positives and negatives from those games, and tell me a little bit about what you would like to see inside of Anthem. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.